I'm an environmentalist, and I'm a green, and I'm going to keep my comments short, partly so that you can throw things at me afterwards if you feel like it, but also because part of what I planned to present was some work that we've done at the Reason Foundation, and that actually primarily Sam has done the research for an upcoming publication on sustainable development. And a lot of it is information that you've heard already today, and you'll continue to hear, and that Sam can cover much better than I can. But suffice it to say that the publication could be seen as both some tools and messaging for working both with sustainable development advocates and with planners, which is not a species that I pretend to know that much about, but hopefully Sam's going to fill in on what I don't cover here. So my main objective is just to talk, to remove a little bit of the mystery about what sustainable development is, and I hope that, like the comments before mine, that this is a hopeful topic, and that all of you can be sustainable development advocates as well. So the questions are not only what is sustainable development, but what is it not? I wish I could actually put up some complicated slides here to back me up, but I don't have any. So just ignore that. How is it being practiced in urban planning in the United States? Should I turn that off? Okay. What results are being achieved through applying sustainable development framework to urban planning so far in the United States, and what lessons can we infer about the use of urban planning to achieve sustainable development objectives? So to go all the way back, as some of you might know, the original and most popular definition of sustainable development comes from the 1987 report from the Brundtland Commission, convened by the United Nations, and that's the definition that most, for better or worse, most advocates of sustainable development use today, and that's the definition that says the ability of humanity to ensure that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it can be a vague and difficult definition to deal with. First of all, it assumes that we know what the future needs of humanity are. And I think Sam has some comments on that particular topic. One of the most useful publications on this so far actually is the Electronic Journal of Sustainable Development, which just had their first issue out this summer. And I was really happy to see that the first article in that first issue deals with this definition of sustainable development, and Dr. Neil Manson from the University of Mississippi argues, I think convincingly, that sustainable development can be viewed as a political slogan similar to compassionate conservatism or the precautionary principle, and that it's really intended to forge a political compromise. It's meant to be just vague enough and minimal enough in content that it won't be objectionable to anyone. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Political compromise is, after all, how we actually progress in these policy arenas that are really important to us. So it's unobjectionable because few people would argue that people's needs should not be met now and in the future. And at the same time, it's broad enough to tolerate radically different interpretations. And to that list, I'd also add smart growth as being a political slogan that is intended to bring together some probably politically differing views and to forge a kind of path forward on these issues, although smart growth probably to a greater degree than the other terms does have certain predefined outcomes and methods that are associated with that basic concept. And part of what I want to explain or elaborate on is that sustainable development doesn't necessarily have these preconceived outcomes associated with it. So my favorite definition of sustainable development actually comes from the ecological economist Herman Daly, and who, with Robert Goodland, who's an advisor to the World Bank, wrote in 1996 in an article I'll take a sip of water. Detractors claim environmental sustainability is like pornography. You'll know it when you see it. Sustainability must not become a landfill dump for everyone's environmental and social wish lists. To postpone such a horrific result, detractors pursue two evasive actions. The first is to load everything that they desire, such as freedom, democracy, gender balance, equality, equity, into the sustainability bandwagon. The second is to refuse to define environmental sustainability, to keep it fuzzy, or in other words, to keep it pornographic. And some detractors claim that sustainability cannot be defined and that or made operational. Sam might agree with some of those things. Herman Daly specified, like most philosophers and theoreticians in this area, that there really should be three types of sustainability that are considered: social, environmental, and economic. And he's written mostly on the environmental sustainability issue, but advocated, as I do, that they're clearest when they're kept separate, and then we explore the relationships between all three. And he also specified that sustainable development is only one means of achieving environmental sustainability. So the definition that they actually give in that article is: sustainable development is development without growth and throughput of matter and energy beyond regenerative and absorptive capacities, which might seem even more vague, but it's actually getting at the scientific basis here. In simple translation, that would mean that we use while we use natural resources, such as the atmosphere, forests, fisheries, topsoil, groundwater, we don't use them in such a way that their capacity to provide useful services is diminished and damaged. Daly and Goodland also provided that there's a quasi-environmental sustainability that you can approach by using the depletion of non-renewable resources, for example, petroleum, to finance the development and of renewable substitutes for those non-renewable resources. And with petroleum, clearly we can see that development pattern emerging. While we use petroleum, we fully expect to develop other renewable resources that will substitute the uses of petroleum, and that actually does fall into some definitions of sustainable development. The other two concepts related to that are cultivated natural capital, and also human capital, man-made capital. Cultivated natural capital, like farmed fish, partly substitute for true natural capital, for example, wild fisheries. And man-made capital, like groundwater pumps, are strongly determinant on our ability to leverage the use of true natural capital, like groundwater. And through history, what we've seen in developing countries is that more and more, initially, man-made capital was the limiting factor, and what sustainable development theoreticians really focus on is the idea that there are true limits to natural capital, and that those limits eventually become your limiting factor rather than your ability to extract or access that natural capital through man-made or human capital. So obviously, the analogy that's being used here with sustainable development is borrowed from, in environmental sustainability, is borrowed from the definition of economic sustainability, in that we're talking about natural capital as being a set amount of resources that we have, and the sustainable development path is one in which we live off of the income from that capital rather than liquidating the capital itself. And those relate to ecological concepts that are actually, very well established. They're not just vague and inoperable. One of the criticisms of environmental alarmists is that they've typically focused on worrying about the depletion of natural resources that actually are market goods. And so a really prime example of that would be Paul Ehrlich, who predicted world famine in the 1970s as a result of population growth and food shortages. And obviously that didn't happen because we know that any time that things like metals and petroleum food, these are market goods, they don't, true economic scarcity doesn't actually occur because of the market forces. That's not the case when we talk about environmental goods that aren't valued by the market. And that's where sustainable development really comes into play. So in the simplest sense, greater sustainability is achieved when we produce the same or greater welfare with fewer resources. And if there's one simple message that I can really deliver right now, that's that sustainable development, this concept, isn't controversial. We'd be in really bad shape today if pollution and environmental degradation grew at the same or greater rate than as compared to economic productivity or population. And of course that hasn't happened, again because of market forces. And what the sustainable development field is really concerned with is putting measurements to sustainability to chart our progress in using resources more efficiently. And by some counts, there are more than 500 projects ongoing to devise better sustainability indicators. And sounds like a lot, probably means that no one's figured it out quite exactly right so far. A couple of the most popular indexes that are currently being used are the Environmental Sustainability Index, which is produced by a team at Yale and Columbia. And it represents a state of environmental systems, the stresses on those systems, human vulnerability to environmental change in the form of loss of food or exposure to environmental diseases. It goes on. In all, it's 67 variables organized into 22 core areas. The ecological footprint is another measure, and that's based on the quantitative land and water requirements needed to sustain a given living standard. So in that case, the consumption of a given living behavior is measured in terms of acres. And then the genuine progress indicator, which is related or a sort of green GDP. And that again relates to this idea that the definition given by Herman Daly, which is that sustainable development is development without growth in throughput of matter, but rather the development in the way that we use that matter. It's growth in complexity without growth, absolute growth. So the green GDP is in contrast to the conventional GDP, which counts, every single car crash, every divorce, every arrest, every toxic contamination spill as a growth in economic development because it creates jobs, it creates economic activity. The genuine progress indicator, or green GDP, tries to put other indices, other measurements into that same measure. What sustainable development is not. Sustainable development is not a mandate for centralized planning, and it's not a prescription for a certain model of urban living. The Brundtland report itself makes this pretty clear. It actually specifies that the pursuit of sustainable development requires a political system that secures effective citizen participation in decision making, an economic system that's able to generate surpluses and technical knowledge on a self-reliant and sustained basis, a social system that provides for solutions for the tensions arising from disharmonious development, a production system that respects the obligation to preserve the ecological base for development, a technological system that can search continuously for new solutions, an international system that fosters sustainable patterns of trade and finance, and an administrative system that is flexible and has the capacity for self-correction. Sustainable development's not an absolute limit to growth, and it's not a measure that's independent of time, place, and cultural values, which is pretty clear in all of these definitions. And I'd also add that as an urban design principle, sustainable development is partially a response to perceived shortcomings in conventional planning. Probably from the perspective of most sustainable development advocates, all they're doing is taking a mechanism that's already in place, which is centralized planning, and correcting, from their perspective, correcting flaws in the goals of that conventional planning process. Now, the flaws in the actual planning process are already there. They're just trying to change the outcomes. And that's really part of the focus of this soon-to-be published piece, is really to criticize whether the mechanism of planning is consistent with the goals of sustainable development. So briefly, I don't know how much time I have left. Okay. We look at a couple different studies, case studies. The first is an analysis done by Philip Burke and Maria Manta-Conroy in 2000, which looked at 30 comprehensive plans across the United States that were considered high-quality plans. 10 of those were cities that used sustainability as a general framework explicitly in their planning process, and the remaining 20 were just high-quality plans based on various criteria. They looked at those, and from the plans that use sustainability as a explicit criteria, they synthesized key concepts, translated them into 6 principles, and then scored all 30 plans on how well they met those 6 criteria, the principles of sustainability. And not surprisingly, the average sustainability scores for both sets, both the conventional high-quality plans and the plans that explicitly use sustainable development in their framework, were similar. The high-quality plans were actually slightly higher than the average scores for the cities fully integrating sustainability into their planning, and that shows us 2 things. We don't know which it indicates more strongly. The first is that measures of sustainability in urban planning are weak, probably lacking almost entirely in most cases, and that prescriptive goals and processes thought to be sustainable have, to a very large degree, been incorporated into the general orthodoxy of urban planning in the United States, whether or not they explicitly are pursuing the sustainable development goals. Briefly, we looked at Santa Monica, California as a case study, and as many of you probably know, it was one of the first cities to integrate sustainable development into their planning process. It's considered a model city. It's not an average city by any standards, not even by California standards. Its urban footprint is small, its population is dense, it's a beach community and a high-income community as well. And so it's got a population density that's higher than, a third higher than Los Angeles and nearby beach communities, and about twice as dense as San Diego, San Jose, and Sacramento. Their program was initiated in 1984, and very sensibly and very luckily for us, they incorporated eventually 66 multifaceted indicators into their sustainability framework so that they could track their own progress. Those were clustered around 8 areas: resource conservation, environmental and public health, transportation, economic development, open space and land use, housing, community education and civic participation, and human dignity. So again, these are value-based, subjective areas, but they do illustrate that this isn't just an environmental agenda. They are taking into account these various goals, both social, economic, and environmental. And briefly, they did meet some of their goals, although most of their goals were just to progress in these various measures. So, so the targets are pretty arbitrary. They failed to meet targets set for water use, wastewater generation, and average vehicle ridership, among other goals. And one of the problems with their criteria seemed to be that they selected absolute rather than per capita measures. And for all the reasons that you've been hearing about all day, obviously the pretty strict land use controls and other regulations that they enacted in this city, both as part of the Sustainable Development Program and otherwise, have contributed to a pretty distinct demographic trend in the city where they've, since the 1990s, Santa Monica has had a 3.3% decline in population, while during the same period the state population increase has been 13.6%. They have almost double the workforce population than they do the residential population, which for sustainability measurements creates all kinds of problems, not the least of which is that they have this immense imbalance between wastewater generation and actual water use in the city, because I think, as someone was talking about earlier, it's kind of the effect of everyone bringing their coffees into the city and pouring them down the urinal, but these aren't people that actually live in the city. So this isn't just specific to Santa Monica. It's clearly played out in a lot of California coastal communities and elsewhere. The rest of our paper I'll let Sam talk about a little bit and some of the lessons there. But I think what I really just wanted to highlight was that sustainable development doesn't necessarily demand a planning process. There are both weaknesses and strengths that we can elaborate on, and that maybe the most important thing is to develop really strong performance criteria for sustainable development, and that's a process that we can be involved in wherever these processes are going on. That in fact criteria can be developed independent of an actual sustainability program, and that's actually a really good thing to do, because we can use that to demonstrate the ways that markets actually help us to meet some of these sustainable development goals, and that sustainable development in many ways can be superior to just a pure environmental program, although that they're not mutually exclusive, obviously. And that'll be it.